You are listening to Nabila Usman and Stephen Imedegu at KADBUSA.
You're welcome back into the conversations. It's still Radio Now's Now Breakfast coming to you live from KADBUSA in the city, the state of Kaduna. And our conversation this morning looks at drug abuse. Drug abuse or substance abuse refers to the use of certain chemicals for the purpose of creating pleasurable effects on the brain. Now this morning we're going to be speaking with a gentleman right here in Kaduna whose job it is to help those who are facing drug challenges. We're speaking with the Director General of the Kaduna State Bureau for Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment, KADBUSA, Mr. Joseph Ike. KADBUSA under the Director General has been focused on preventing the treatment, the care, and the provision of support services for people with drug use disorders and other mental health problems. Mr. Ike, you're also a creative, and we know that we hear that you found a number of creative endeavors. We are glad to have you with us in the studio this morning.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here this morning.
You remind me of lawyers who end up becoming journalists. You're all just disguising yourselves, because what are you doing as DG of KADBUSA and claiming creative as well? You have to drop one of those hats.
No, I think the beauty of life is that you don't. It's a scam when they tell you that you have to. You could do everything that makes you happy as long as it's right.
It's how he just indirectly called me a scam. It's all right, no problem.
Well, you have in the past talked about the severity of the drug challenge that Kaduna is facing, and even moving it to a national level. The NDLE here has talked about how serious drug problems are in Nigeria as a nation. But in a conversation that you held, which I listened to and read up, one of the things that you talked about were the numbers specifically, and you were talking specifically about Kaduna State. You indicated that 10.9% of the people in Kaduna State are involved in drug use, and you attributed this to Nigeria now being a drug consumption nation versus being a drug transit nation in the past. Is this something that you can speak to us on?
Yes, I think when we say this, it's important for us to be clear that drug use and drug abuse are not necessarily the same thing. So yes, there is as at the last UNODC country report on Nigeria, there was a prevalence of about 10% in Kaduna of drug use. Now, when we talk about drug abuse, like you said during the introduction, that's when people use drugs mainly for recreational purposes, but in a manner that causes harm to them or others around them. So there is that element of risk and harm that must be present before we could say this is abuse. And then beyond abuse, we have something known as a spectrum of disorders that have to do with dependence, where someone can no longer function on some level without actually using drugs. And I think what most people think about instinctively when we talk about drugs is dependence, because that's what we know when we have loved ones, we have friends, we know people who are not able to stop even when they need to and when they should, when it's clearly doing them harm. So that's a completely different health concern. But yes, you are right. If someone doesn't use drugs, they can't abuse it or become dependent on it. So as a whole, if we can just get people to make other choices in terms of what they do to achieve pleasure or relaxation, whatever it is, rather than going the path of drug use, that would be a better outcome from a health perspective.
I'm curious about the numbers. Every time we discuss drug abuse in Nigeria, I think about a UNODC report I read that looked at Nigeria in the 80s, and as of then they were projecting that, look, in 20 years or so, Nigeria would be a destination, a source, a transit point for drugs across the region and the rest of the world. And if you listened to the news recently, you'd have seen, maybe Stephen will help me with the Igbo word, but in the southeast we had issues with labs that were being found producing
in the east is referred to as Mkpuru Mmiri.
Mkpuru Mmiri. Thank you. I might forget that later.
That's all
but
right.
And then, up north, you've got the codeine issue. KADBUSA happens to have Rona Maya, who was the journalist that did the Sweet Sweet Codeine documentary, right? And we saw what the government did after that. We have the weed issue. There's a debate on whether or not weed is harmful, to what degree, should it be legalized. Our lawmakers have tried to debate that a few times. So what I'd really like you to do is describe for us just how critical of an issue this is. If you have numbers, it would be good to get some numbers.
Okay, so one of the things that we desperately need to do is to update the numbers that we have. The last comprehensive household survey we did, and I think it's the most in our history, it's the most comprehensive survey we've done on drugs, is the country report that the Federal Ministry of Health, the UNODC, Nigerian Bureau of Statistics did in 2018. 2018 data is great, as it is more recent than 1980s data, but 2018 is a long time ago. In today's world, things change very, very rapidly. So we need a system not just of gathering a baseline data, but also of updating that data regularly. We should have these data on an annual basis to be able to track progress, but we don't presently. It's something that we're taking very seriously in Kaduna, and we're putting the necessary mechanisms in place, working with the Kaduna Bureau of Statistics and other partners to conduct a household survey in Kaduna towards the end of the year, to get a sense of where exactly are we with numbers of what you're talking about. Now, you mentioned, Murumi, which while most people think it is a novel substance of abuse, it actually isn't. It's crystal methamphetamine. In places like Abuja, Lagos, and other cities, it's called ice. So it's something that most people understand that is quite common.
Just to interrupt you for a moment. I mean, what seems novel, and you can correct me here, is the number of labs we've discovered, the fact that it's being produced here in the country.
And in that sense, I think you're very right. The big challenge with crystal methamphetamine and amphetamine-like substances in general is that they can be produced, they can be manufactured here in labs that are clandestine. These labs are terrible. I mean, one of the things we know, for example, is that it takes about 8 years to clean up the environmental damage from one of these labs. It seeps into the water table. It's devastating to have these labs, but then we know that they are present, and it's very difficult to identify them, police them, and stop them. So it's something we really need to be careful about, because, like you rightly said, people are abusing these drugs here in Nigeria. So it's being manufactured not necessarily for export, but for domestic use. And that's a major problem. That's a very big problem. The extent of that problem, I don't even think we have a full grasp on. And it's something that we really do need to invest in, not just understanding, but in responding to as quickly as we can.
Now, in 2022, you talked about what Kaduna is doing to address the drug problems. You described it as engaging in the legislative and the legal framework, first of all. Can you speak to us about what that is and how, setting up sort of like a framework to address the problem versus simply going out there, finding people who consume drugs, arresting them? How is this method of facing the problem better than, can I call it the big stick method?
So I think what I meant at that time was that Kaduna has a law, and it's a law on prevention and treatment of substance abuse. I think laws like this complement existing laws, because we have quite a bit of laws and policies that handle the supply reduction aspect of things. What Kaduna has done is to create a mechanism, legislate a mechanism to address demand reduction, to say that as a state, we find this issue to be important enough to deal with from a public health perspective, where we would do what we do with every other major public health issue. We would institutionalize prevention mechanisms. We will provide treatment services, and the treatment services, we will tailor them to be appropriate to the spectrum of the disorder. So we have primary care, secondary care, tertiary care. We would also make sure that in doing so, we will focus on evidence-based approaches. We would prioritize community-based interventions. We would ensure that everything that we're doing is available, is accessible. It's something that people can understand. And we're not just saying this for saying sake. We're putting it in writing. We're legislating it. We're putting the necessary frameworks to deliver on this. We're putting it in our budget line. We're making this such that, no, it's not just talk. It's not just, random programs here and there. It is something that is part of a system. To put it in perspective for you, this year, one of the main things that the world is prioritizing when it comes to drug use issues are prevention services. But with prevention services, the big question we're asking, and I don't just mean in Kaduna now, I mean on a global scale, is how can we build systems to deliver on prevention? There is really a talk now about putting things into systems, or rather building systems, rather than isolated interventions, which we're a lot more used to. You get a little bit of money, you get a little bit of support, you do yours, I do mine, you do yours, he does his. But can we start looking at structures and systems, because they're more sustainable, and most importantly, they're more scalable. If you have a system that is operating in a community, it's easier for you to scale that system up to the local government and scale it up to the state, and then maybe even scale it up nationally. Isolated programs, maybe not so much, because you know how diverse Nigeria is. So that was what I meant when I was talking about how we have the laws, we're looking at the frameworks, the policies, but then we are also, as aggressively as we can, implementing the programs and building the systems that we need to address the issue.
I'm encouraged by the idea that we are conscious of the global conversation, how we need to tweak it for our own reality. I'm curious about how much synergy we're seeing between the subnational levels and the national level. The NDLEA in the last 5 years or so has been revamped. I remember traveling between Abuja and Kaduna by road, and for the first time, I think, in my whole life, I did see an NDLEA checkpoint where, they were looking out for substances. And in bringing that synergy into conversation, I'd like you to speak to us on also how drug abuse and mental health are related, and the extent to which government across the levels seem to be aware of what we're doing about it.
So there is a very strong relationship between drug abuse and mental health. For starters, both actually act on the same organ. We're talking about the brain. So when you take something to feel high, you're affecting the brain. When you have anything related to mental health, we're talking about the brain. Like I mentioned earlier, drug use disorders are classified as mental illnesses. In fact, the WHO classification, when we talk about mental health, is mental, neurological, and substance use disorders. So those are the three broad categories of illnesses that fall under what we typically talk about as mental health, or mental illnesses, sorry. So there is a relationship there. Now, one of the things, though, that I think in common speak, when we talk about mental illness, we're talking about psychotic disorders or other mental illnesses. We typically don't include substance use when we're talking about that. From that perspective, we also have a common misconception, which is that there's a causal relationship between drug abuse and mental illness. What I mean by that is, when you abuse drugs, you will go mad. That's what we typically understand. Now, it's not necessarily causal. We know there's a relationship between these two things, but we don't know that this necessarily always causes this. What's interesting to note is that when people have certain mental illnesses, it actually does drive them to use drugs. So that relationship is not unidirectional. It's not drugs that lead people to mental illness. We also know that mental illnesses lead people to drug use. So it's a chicken and egg situation. Which comes first? What is truly the nature of that relationship is an ongoing question for research and all of that. But regardless of which it is, what we know is if you are using substances, there's an increased risk of other mental illnesses. And if you do have an existing mental illness, there is a huge chance that if you do use drugs, it will make things a lot worse. So while we know there's a relationship, we know this is a relationship that is not a positive relationship. It is one that we need to be mindful of and to address where we see both. What I mean by that is if a patient comes in or a client comes in and they have a drug use disorder, we need to make sure they don't have another mental illness, because if they do, we have to manage both. Otherwise, the prognosis for both are not good. So there is a relationship, a very strong relationship.
So I apologize for interrupting you,
Yes.
but speaking about relationships, drug use, drug abuse, substance abuse oftentimes seems to be mentioned in the same bracket with the creative space. Glorified in some instances, and in others just simply acknowledged as what happens in those spaces. How can we start to differentiate? How can we start to break up this unholy alliance?
What I wanted to say instinctively was maybe creatives should not use drugs as much, but that would be buying into the stereotype. I mean, stereotypes oftentimes are not the truth of a situation. They are convenient, they're summary. We just assume them because we say, okay, it's stereotype, Igbo boys are fine. Well, I mean, in most cases that is true, but
Wow.
then no, I'm just giving you a common stereotype.
Sorry, oh.
But in some cases it may
The
not
problem
really.
is the Ike and the Imediegu here.
Oh,
but
okay.
go
I
on.
didn't even realize that. But you have the stereotype. So, drug use is prevalent among creative spaces. Well, do we have creative spaces where drugs are used? Oh, definitely. We know that. We know music videos where we talk about getting high and all of that and things like that. But I also think that creative spaces are a reflection of the communities they exist in. And so oftentimes the reason you would have a song about getting high is because people want to listen to that while they are getting high. And is it something that I think that we need to address? I think, yes, that creatives can be an agent of positive change. And when it comes to mental health, when it comes to drug use, I certainly believe that there's a huge part for creatives to play, particularly when it comes to sensitization of the general community on the real issues involved in what we're talking about with mental health and drug abuse.
A sense of responsibility and fixing the problem. We just spoke with the Director General of the Kaduna State Bureau for Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment, KADBUSA, Mr. Joseph Ike, and he talked extensively about what his agency is doing to address substance abuse and drug use in Kaduna State. And I would like to say to everyone who's watching and listening, please don't do drugs, whatever you do. This is still your Beyond the News Station, Radio Now 95.3 FM Lagos. Now Breakfast is coming to you from the city, the state, the people of Kaduna at KABAFest 2024. Do stay with us.
You are listening to Nabila Usman and Stephen Imediegu at KABAFest.